Every parsha.
We were doing midday here, and Marv here at dinner, the third English house here, he would talk on it.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, good evening. We are in the middle of a discourse of the Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Rebbe of Lubavitch, discussing Achdus Hashem, discussing the unity of God with the world. Good evening, David. Discussing the unity of God with the world, the topic of Achdus Hashem. I don't know where anyone is. I just come here and say the class. If no one's here, I say it. If someone's here, I also say it. It's none of my business, really. Some people interpret the fact that you're supposed to be your brother's keeper as I have to be totally involved in his business at all times, which I'm not a proponent of. If that's what it means, I'm not my brother's keeper. It's all good. Anyway, we are in the middle of the Rebbe Rashab's explanation of the third perspective. What do we mean by the third perspective? Really, we're explaining how nothing has changed, how ani havaya lo shanisi, as the verse says and as Chassidus interprets, God hasn't changed at all. The creation of the world, astonishingly, astoundingly, amazingly, we are taught does not constitute any change for Hashem. From Hashem's perspective, really, in truth, from the perspective of the truth, nothing has changed. The creation of the world does not constitute a change. How can such a thing be true? How can it be true that there's no change? Well, we started explaining that if you look at it in terms of the process of creation, the process God enters into to create, then of course, on the process side, any concealment or any change is really a further expression of godliness, a further expression of the Ein Sof. This is what we've said in previous classes. And for those who need review, I recommend go learning and studying the previous classes. This is what we explain, the concept of Ein Etzem Master Al Etzem, a self cannot conceal itself. God's so-called self-concealment is really not a concealment at all, because the concealment is as godly as the thing that was revealed. It's all God. The thing that was revealed was God. The thing that conceals what was revealed is God. It's all equally godliness. So really, God can't hide. You can't escape the truth, because the truth is all there is, right? There's nowhere to hide. Everything in this process where God is concealing himself, where God is hiding himself, all of this is just further godliness, is further an expression of the Ein Sof, of the infinite. But now the question is, so that's one perspective. Good evening. The second perspective we said is that obviously in terms of God himself, right, none of these changes are really significant, because God himself in general transcends the very dichotomy of revelation and self-concealment. God is beyond all these possible changes, possible concealments, God himself. So God himself and the process, so to speak, that God enters into to create, from both of these perspectives, of both of these stages, we see that there's no change. There's one slight third perspective. There's one slight hitch in the plan that we have left to explain, which is, what about the actual creation, right? Or to put it more casually, what about us, right? God himself, there's no change. The process God enters into to create the world, that process itself constitutes no change. But at the end of the day, as I once read in a certain book, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, right? Something has been created here. There's something called the creation. Before there was a creation, there was just God. And now there's God and something else. Actually, not just one thing else, but an infinite number of other things. So how can you say that there's no change if God goes from being alone, so to speak, with nothing else? We described this in terms of the whole system only had one pole. It only had one end, right? God was the end of the system on one side, and the system extended infinitely in every direction. There was no other side. There was no other perspective on reality. And then what does God do? God creates not just one other perspective on reality, but an infinite number of perspectives on reality. God creates creations. He creates something other than himself. And so the question is, how could it be that nothing has changed? How can it be, as the verse says, Ani avaya lo shanisi, that nothing truly changes in respect to Hashem, if there's a rather dramatic change? Once upon a time in Judaism, we believe in creation, right? As the first verse of the Torah describes, once upon a time there was nothing created, there was God alone. And then there was something else. How can you say nothing changed? And the answer that we're in the middle of explaining, the answer to this question is that really there isn't anything else. That's really the secret. The creations are not actually other. The creations only seem to be other than Hashem. But in fact, the creations are what we call batul, which we normally translate as nullified. Right? Like in halacha, in Jewish law, the drop of milk that accidentally falls into the big pot of cholent is sometimes considered nullified. We consider it legally as if it's not there. Right? So too the world, if you really understand the way that God creates the world, which is what we're in the middle of discussing, you'll realize that the world too is nullified. The world does not constitute another perspective the way that God is a perspective. The perspective of the world is not only incomparable to God's perspective, but in fact cannot even be called other, cannot be called a separate perspective at all. Really, the creation is not what it seems, in other words. The creation, the reality of the creation is not a yesh, is not a something separate from God, that you have two somethings, you have God and the world. The true reality of the creation is to be ayin. The true reality of the creation is to be nothing. And the core of all created realities is actually nullification. The extent to which they are nothing is the extent to which they exist, as we discussed last week. It is only because this reality is not separate from God in any way that it can exist. And so to every detail of the reality. This pen will be our example for this class. The very reason why this pen exists is actually because it's nothing, in the sense of being nullified, in the sense of it's the fact that it's not a separate thing from Hashem is the only thing that allows it to exist. This point inside of each thing, where each thing is nullified, you could call it soul. That's really what you could call it. You could call the point within each thing where it's nullified, you could say is its soul. Now, what I've just said is much more complicated, because then you have to deal with the difference between spirit and matter, and the difference, what do we mean by a soul? Maybe each thing has multiple souls. Very complicated. And what is the rest of the thing if not its soul? I'm not intending to introduce a separation between each thing and its soul. That's not the point. So that whole statement has to be taken with a large grain of salt. But we'll hopefully work through and explain some of these issues as we go on. Yes?
If we learned last week, the question is, does God exist?
Yeah. 2 weeks ago, yeah.
2 weeks ago. And then do we go back to, we say, does that pen exist?
Yeah. What do you mean?
Does that pen exist?
I don't want to confuse things at the moment. Maybe at the end we'll discuss what this means for our definitions of existence, right? I'm glad you brought up the idea of God existing, because that pertains, what we discussed 2 weeks ago pertains directly to today's class. What did we discuss 2 weeks ago? Let's say it in...
Nothing last week.
Correct. We're going to continue discussing something from nothing this week. Let's say it in different words. I like to change the words as we go to give opportunities. Sometimes different words have a different, make more sense to other people. So let's recap slightly what we said 2 weeks ago in different words. We'll start from a different angle, but hopefully quickly the regulars will see that this is really the same discussion. The place I want to start this week is like this. What is rationality? To be rational, to relate to the world in a rational way. It's actually a very difficult question to answer. So.
It's like morals. Morals are defined by whoever's talking.
Okay, but I'm not saying what's a specific moral. I'm saying what does it mean, or a specific rational concept. What does it mean to be rational in general, as opposed to irrationality or irrationality?
It's somebody else's perspective of how you act, or think, or talk.
Why do you say that? I relate to...
Because the same thing with morality. Somebody else's
perspective.
Even if it is defined as a personal perspective, even if people disagree about whether a particular thing is rational, you still have to agree on what rational means to disagree about whether a particular thing is rational, right? If you disagree on whether I don't know, whether a tea biscuit tastes good or not, right? So you can agree or disagree whether it tastes good, but everyone understands at least that there's something called taste good, which is the opposite of taste bad, and you can disagree on the particulars in a particular case. So I would say like this. I think first of all, yes, please.
Maybe a thought process that doesn't break something.
That doesn't break something. Very interesting definition. I like that definition. I actually think that that's maybe even a different way of saying what I'm about to say. It's a very interesting definition. It's a good definition.
Internally or externally.
Right, exactly. In other words, it's harmonious, you could say, right? Harmonious with the nature of each thing, right? Respecting the nature of each thing, right?
With your surroundings,
right?
Because it seems to be relative.
Right.
A relative thing.
Very good. Exactly, a relative thing. So the way I was going to say it, which is, I think, the exact same thing in other words, what I was going to say, and of course, I think it's very difficult to define such a thing like rationality. So we'll just use this as a working definition. What we're talking about. I'm sure that there's cases that don't fall under this definition, or there's issues with this definition. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. We're being very loose and limber. Hopefully, everyone's with me in being loose and limber in this regard.
I haven't done yoga in a year. I had enough. I'm loose and I'm loose.
We're going to do, we need to do some stretches. But I was going to say that rationality, very simply, is how things fit together. That's how I was going to define rationality. I think it's very similar to what Yaakov was saying. Rationality is how things fit together, right? Rationality is I have one thing with a certain nature, whatever that means, which that nature exerts a certain presence in terms of its relations to other things, which these types of relations in rationality are called logic. They have certain logics, logical systems, logical rules that the mind can usually comprehend or grasp to some extent. And these things, either they go together or they don't go together. If they go together and they go together naturally, that's called rationally fitting together. And if they break, if they don't go together, right? If that harmony is broken, if the things don't go together, we call that irrationality. Now, of course, this doesn't really answer any of the profound questions you could ask about rationality, such as, is there an objective thing called rationality? How does a human being have an intuitive grasp of rationality, which is an interesting question. This is something people just seem to know at some point in the child's development. They seem to be able to access certain forms of rationality, even some animals, of course, right? Access rationality, rational ways of thinking to a certain extent, right? So that's all very interesting. That's not what we're talking about in our class. I bring this up to make a very specific point. There's a certain perspective on the world which is focused and sets as its highest bar. In other words, the most important thing you can do is be rational. And traditionally, this is what's called philosophy, although the word, as it was originally defined and used in ancient Greece, had a much broader definition and remit than it does now. Nowadays, it's a very stuffy thing that happens in universities that seems to have nothing to do with real life. Back then, it was a whole spiritual way of life that embraced everything. Philosophy included science and math and music speech, rhetoric, grammar. Everything was really, in the ancient Greece, the philosophy was the queen. Philosophy was the queen of knowledge, and everything else was just subcategories. Everything else, in other words, if you actually learn the way they used to think in the ancient world, it was all about integrating, which is rationality. Rationality is that it shouldn't be that music has different rules than geometry, which has different rules than observing clams like Aristotle used to do, picking clams out of the water and looking at how they work, right? These things should all have a certain harmony. They should all go together. That's the most satisfying philosophical worldview in terms of rationality, is how things fit together. So it's the study of how things fit together. That's philosophy, yes.
Interestingly enough, now all the scientists and the various different systems of science are trying to find a universal,
Yes.
all-encompassing
Right.
system,
Right.
where they all fit. Because right now they're not working together.
Right. They're trying to find a more harmonious system. They're trying to work back, which is interesting because it's after a big break in that way of thinking. So that's also a very interesting topic. But philosophy, how things fit together, right? So that's, to the philosopher, what we are going to call a philosopher in our class, that just means a person who sets everything fitting together as their absolute highest standard. That comes first. That's the first priority, is that everything has to fit together, right? A philosopher in traditional philosophy, and we explained more about this 2 weeks ago, I don't want to get all bogged down in the details again, but a philosopher in the traditional understanding, the way Aristotle, for example, or Lahavdil, Rav Saadia Gaon, or the Rambam were in their philosophical works, right, within Judaism, they all arrived at a concept of something like God. Now, it's debatable if they all arrived at the same concepts, and the methods they used to arrive at these conclusions are, of course, debatable and of subjects of great study, etc. That's not really what's important to us. What's important to us is that the philosophical God is the God that is needed to make everything fit together, right? If you're following what I'm saying so far. The philosophical God, the God of philosophy, like Aristotle knew, or Lahavdil, the Rambam knew when he was doing philosophy, or Rav Saadia Gaon, or the first chapters of the Chavos HaLevavos, the duties of the heart, or Rav Solomon ibn Gavirol, or Rav Chisdai Kreskas, or Rav Yosef Albo, right? All the famous Jewish philosophers I'm listing now, right? They, in their philosophical works, arrive at a God and demonstrate a God, or attempt to demonstrate a God, who is the God of things fitting together. In other words, God is a cog, God is a puzzle piece, how I said it 2 weeks ago, right? God is necessary for them because of the way they think of the world and the way they see everything fitting together. They say, this depends on this, which depends on this, and all of these things ultimately depend on God. God is the baseline reality that supports the whole structure of things fitting together. He's the central puzzle piece in the puzzle of the traditional philosopher. Now, we explained 2 weeks ago that this is what's called the God that exists. What do we mean by exists? Something very important to tonight's class, what we're going to read tonight. It's very important to understand what we mean by exists. When we say this is the God that exists, what we mean is that he can be used as an explanation for everything else that exists. That's what we mean when he exists, right? As a logical explanation. In other words, he fits. What do we mean when we say things fit together, right? We mean, at the most basic level, before we get into all of the complications, we mean they both exist in the same reality as one another. Because if they don't exist in the same reality, if we say something does not exist, something that does not exist does not have a logical place. It doesn't fit into this puzzle, right? There's nowhere for it to fit in. It doesn't exert any effect in logic. It simply is not here in the same reality, right? So, for example, a very basic thing of things fitting together is that the pen is now on the table. I've just made a rational statement. It's how things fit together. The table is not on the pen. The pen is on the table, and you can use your eyes to check this state of affairs, right? Logic, rational, right?
Depends on your perspective.
For the pen to be, that's also true. For the pen to be on the table, right? They both have to exist. There is no pen that is on a table that does not exist. And there's no table that can hold a pen that doesn't exist, right? If one exists and the other doesn't. That's what we mean by exist. By exist, we mean they're in the same web of things fitting together. That same logical web, that same puzzle of things all fitting together, they all exist. Everything that fits into that web is something that is, something that exists. The God that exists, the God of the philosophers, the reason they arrive at God is because other things in this web point to him, right? I can't explain what is the basis of all things without this concept called God, which is a thing that causes everything else but himself is uncaused, is basically the philosophical definition of God. In other words, everything else in the puzzle depends on him. He depends on nothing else in the puzzle. And that's the relationship. The relationship with God is a one-way relationship. Everything depends on him. He depends on nothing. That's what I mean by a one-way relationship. He explains everything is another way of saying it. Or he causes everything. I've mentioned now 3 classes in a row. It's important to understand that in the ancient philosophy, over 500 years ago, I'm saying, philosophy realized that cause and explain are synonyms. Right? If I need God to explain it, that means at some level God is causing it. The two things go together. Right? So none of these things explain God, but God explains everything. That's the general philosophical definition of God. This God is a God that exists. If he doesn't exist, there is no place for him in rationality. If God does not exist, in other words, if God were to chas v'shalom not be or not exist, he would be of no philosophical efficacy. He wouldn't help me at all with my puzzle. My puzzle, I have to find other ways to fix my puzzle, which is what for the last 500 years many atheist philosophers have tried to do. They have to find ways to fix their puzzle. There's many different ways to go about it or to attempt it. They have to fix their puzzle without reliance on God, right? Whether that works or not is a topic for a different topic for philosophy class, not for Chassidus class, right? So you have the God of philosophy. That's the God that exists. We, 2 weeks ago, critically said that our discourse, and it's so fundamental that it's very hard to understand what our discourse is saying without understanding this. Our discourse is talking about the God of Kabbalah. The God of Kabbalah is a God that does not exist. What do we mean by not exist? Not that he isn't, God forbid, or fails to be. That's not the idea. The idea, rather, is that he transcends being a puzzle piece. He's beyond the rational system. God can be whatever he is. A different way of saying this is that a Kabbalist's baseline necessity is not for everything to rationally fit together. The Kabbalist has something that would be nice, but a Kabbalist has something that's even more important than that, and it's in the name. The name is Kabbalah. Kabbalah means received wisdom. Right? The Kabbalist's most important thing is not rationality, is not understanding how everything around them and everything that exists fits together. The Kabbalist's most important priority is the preservation of the faith tradition that was passed down, teacher to student, teacher to student. That is the Kabbalist's most important baseline thing. That's what Kabbalah means. Kabbalah means I received this. And now this class may help you see the depth, or some of the depth at least, in that name. Why is it important that Kabbalah is called the received wisdom, what I received? Because the whole idea of the Kabbalah is that rationality and making things make sense is nice, but the revelation of God through prophecy to the Jewish people is more important. And whatever that revelation says, that's the truth. It fits, it doesn't fit, it's useful for the puzzle, it's not useful for the puzzle. That's a secondary issue. That's not as important to a Kabbalist. Yes?
Again, coming back to the same point again. Depends who is asking.
Absolutely.
Depending who is
Exactly.
Depending who is studying, depending who is connected.
Absolutely.
The difference between Aristotle and the Alter Rabbi, that Aristotle, there's ego inside his philosophy.
Correct.
When the Rabbi is purest, no egoless,
That's very good. That's very well said.
Connection to the divine, And there's a big difference between connected to the divine approach of philosophy and then somebody that has an ego inside of him.
The Rebbe said like this. You want to hear what the Rebbe said about Aristotle? It's a bit of a distraction, but
No, it's part of the things.
the Rebbe said like this. The Rebbe said, this is from a Sikha of the Rebbe. I've seen it in the book. I forget exactly where. We could look it up again. It's in the I know how to find it because it's in the index of the Rebbe's Fabrengens under Aristotle, under the name Aristotle, right? So if you go look up all the times the Rebbe spoke about Aristotle, you can go see. And the Rebbe told a story about Aristotle, which is very interesting. The Rebbe said about Aristotle that, I don't know where the story comes from, it's very interesting itself, I have no idea. The Rebbe said the following story. He said that Aristotle was once giving a class about a very, very lowly act that a person can do. I don't think the Rebbe says what the act is, right? Something very coarse, grub, low, like an immoral act of some kind. I don't know exactly what it is. And his whole class that day with his students, as they would walk around, was about how this act is very lowly and beneath the level of a human being. No human being should do this. Later, the students come and they walk in on Aristotle, and Aristotle is doing the act he was describing in the class, whatever it was. And they said, Hayitachen, I'm sure they didn't say Hayitachen, but they said in Greek, how could it be? How could it be that Aristotle would do such a thing? And Aristotle told them that when I was giving the class, I was Aristotle. Now I'm not Aristotle anymore. That was the answer. Right. This is actually a very profound story in light of what we've discussed tonight. And the Rebbe explained this is the difference between philosophy and Torah. Right? The Rebbe says that the whole idea of philosophy, right, because it sets rationality as the baseline, as we've discussed tonight, of things fitting together rationally as the baseline, right? The human being, when he is acting not as a rational being, philosophy says nothing to him, right? In other words, the philosopher says, okay, philosophy is all about rationality. And Aristotle understands perfectly rationally why this act is below a human being and no one should do it, right? It's a lowly act, no one should do it. The problem is that Aristotle is not just an intellect. Aristotle is not purely rational, right? Aristotle is a created human being. He has other things to him than rationality. And philosophy only speaks at the register of rationality. So if you make yourself into a perfectly rational being, then yes, philosophy could be a very great guide to life because it can show you, it could guide you to what's rationally a good behavior, what's rationally a bad behavior. The problem is that very, very few people are rational human beings, number one. And number two, you have a problem. The problem is that if I'm not a rational human being, why would I listen to philosophy when philosophy tells me to be a rational human being? Right? It's a vicious cycle, right? I can't. How do I jumpstart philosophy? How do I say Milichatchila in the first place? I should be a philosopher. I shouldn't do this embarrassing act that Aristotle's describing. There is nothing compelling you. There's nothing that's speaking to you, right? You have to already be there rationally for it to work, for it to have any bearing on who you are. The Rebbe says the Torah, on the other hand, since it is not founded fundamentally on rationality, but rather is founded on the principle that God is the creator of everything, and He took the Jewish people out of Egypt, right? Our foundation is personal, not rational. Therefore, when God speaks to you and He says, don't use the wrong fork for the fish, as my old Tanya teacher used to say, was his example of a sin, right? Terrible sin, using the wrong fork for the fish. Well, he said, when the Torah tells you don't use the wrong fork for the fish, right? He would always say it's your roommate, by the way, my old Tanya teacher. He would never say you, right? He says, when God forbid your roommate is tempted to use the wrong fork for the fish, no one who attends this class would ever have such a temptation, right? When that other person you know has the desire or wants to use the wrong fork for the fish, so when the Torah tells you that, it's telling it to you from the perspective of someone who created you whole cloth from nothing, right? Someone who knows you better than you know yourself, and is not speaking to you at the level of rationality, that you have to be at this level of rationality. In other words, the whole basis of the Torah is that your Creator is meeting you wherever you are. That's the fundamental basis of the system, right? So it's a whole different regard, a whole different application than a pure rational philosophy. Anyway, that's what the Rebbe said about Aristotle. Where were we? we were saying like this. You have the God that exists, you have the God that doesn't exist, the God of Kabbalah, which doesn't mean that he doesn't exist, God forbid. It means he's beyond existence. God as he revealed himself. Now, here's the fundamental difference. The fundamental difference is that the God who revealed himself and is not defined a priori, is not defined from the beginning as having to be rational and having to fix my system, he can do things that the God of philosophy cannot do. Because the God of philosophy has been limited by my understanding of what's logical, so to speak, or what's possible, what's logically possible, I should say. Whereas God himself, who says, if I'm accepting God himself as he is, with no prerequisites to say that everything has to fit together or make sense, right? God has more room to work. And in one way that's very important to our discourse, what's very important to our discourse is that Jews believe, and have believed since time immemorial, that God creates the world yesh me'ayin, something from nothing. Now, something from nothing is a philosophical non-starter. It's like gibberish. It's like saying 2 + 2 = 5. It's a philosophical non-starter. Something from nothing, right? The most basic principle of philosophy is that you cannot give what you do not have, right? Nothing comes from nothing, right? Ex nihilo nil fit, I think is the Latin, right? From nothing, nothing comes. What do you mean it came from nothing? Everything has a cause and everything has an explanation. What's more, even further, aside from this being a base philosophical principle just in general, it's a basic philosophical principle of the God that exists. How did the philosophers arrive at the God that exists, right? They said, this thing needs an explanation. If they could say something comes from nothing, they could stop. They could say, this thing doesn't need an explanation other than itself, right? Maybe it came from nothing. Came from nothing is another way of saying it exists with no explanation, with nothing that causes it, right? There is nothing that explains the existence of this thing. So the philosopher would have stopped at the first step. If the philosopher could use something from nothing, they would never discover God. So what comes out is like this, is that not only is something from nothing a philosophical non-starter, not only does it not make sense in philosophy, but something from nothing would mean that you never get the God that exists. These two gods are completely different, in other words. They're mutually exclusive. If God means to me what fills the puzzle, right, then I can't believe in something from nothing. And if God means to me the God that revealed himself on Mount Sinai, right, puzzle be damned, I don't care about the puzzle, right, then I would never philosophically come to find the God that exists. See what I'm saying? They're mutually exclusive. If you have something from nothing, you don't have philosophy. Right? And if you have philosophy, you don't have something from nothing. So these two gods are actually very different. It's two totally different ways of thinking about God, in other words. So, the God of the Kabbalah, this is now we are into what we discussed last week. Last week we began to explain what I mentioned all the way at the beginning of the class, which is that the worlds are batal, the worlds are nullified, right? The fundamental mistake, and I didn't say it in these words last week because I didn't want to confuse things because we were reading last week. But the fundamental mistake of thinking that this world is something other than godliness, that it's not nullified before God, the initial error, which leads to all the other errors, is thinking that God is the God of philosophy, not the God of Kabbalah. That's fundamentally the error. The error is to believe that when God causes something to be, he causes something, or explains something is a different word for it, right? It serves as the explanation for something. Or when he causes something to be, something to happen, that he does it in a way that is fully explicable according to philosophy. He does it in a way like everything else in our world does. Right? When in fact, the Alter Rebbe says, the truth is that God is not limited to acting in the way that everything else in the world does. God has a different way of causing something to be, which is yesh ma'ayin, which means something from nothing, which means he can cause something to be without being the cause for it. Whatever that means. right? And the fact that we don't understand it and that it doesn't sound like it makes sense to us is the whole point. If it made sense,
But it's not confusing.
if it made sense to us, it wouldn't be yesh ma'ayin, right?
No, but that's very simple to answer for them.
Why?
It's the laptop with the spirit bipolar.
Yeah,
Because the moment the God of philosophy,
yeah,
the spirit has two points. You got the God of philosophy,
yeah,
and you got the God of Kabbalah.
yeah,
The God of Kabbalah goes through the soul, connected directly to the source.
yeah,
The soul to the truth. The God of spirituality, he stays there. So when he stays there, he goes around. It's very, it lessens one dimension of the God of Kabbalah. God of Kabbalah takes you to the source, to the where they call the laptop connected to the source.
Right.
Instead of that laptop
right,
at the bottom.
right, right. So how does that explain something from nothing?
Exactly, because for nothing, when we say for nothing,
Yeah.
it goes to the Kabbalah, because the Kabbalah is connected to source.
Right.
And when you have it connected to the source, as a Yeshama connected to God,
Right.
it's very clear because it comes from God.
Right.
And so it's easier for you to understand that it comes from nothing when it comes to the bipolar side of the spirit. That's
Right.
connected
So in other words,
straight to the
it's
divine.
so what I'm hearing you're saying is that it's super rational. The soul can know it without being rational. That's what you're saying. Because the soul knows its source directly. That's exactly right.
No, but the soul doesn't need a rationality.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, exactly.
The soul, the Neshama is connected to God.
Exactly. In other words, the soul can know this without being able to rationally explain it, because the soul has an aspect that in Chassidus is called l'mayla min ha-seichel, that transcends rationality. That's exactly right.
When
That doesn't mean you can rationally explain it, though.
Yeah, when the other side, when the philosophy is,
Yeah.
he stays there, inside there, the spirit,
Correct.
Doesn't go
Seichel.
further to the Kabbalah.
Yes.
That's the difference. That little difference, the difference between to understand and feel the things of
Yeah.
the dimension,
Yeah.
that to be a little bit below that,
Right.
you need to be proved all the time,
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, does the Renaissance, the pre-Renaissance philosophy, would that include non-explainable events? Would that include telepathic communication? Would that include things that are observable but not proven?
I think that the observable, provable dichotomy is a modern dichotomy. Let me put it that way. So in other words, I think that if a pre-modern philosopher would see something like that and would have no easy explanation to hand, right, the response would not be cling to the empirical and empirically test, which is the modern, so to speak, or at least not all modern, but at least the scientific response, right? The pre-modern response would be that if this is a real phenomenon, I will find the explanation for it. And it's not like the pre-modern philosophers didn't believe in the spirit, right? So why would telepathy, if it does exist, be impossible? Not necessarily, right? So I don't know is the real answer, but it's an interesting question. I think the dichotomy is more modern, but
because it seems like it's
yeah.
It depends on how we define this Aristotelian philosophy.
Yeah.
How narrow do we want to define that? Because if it's all encompassing, maybe they said, hey, spiritual, inexplicable events are part of this web.
But the thing is that I don't think so. Yaakov. I'll tell you why. Because even their commitment to everything being explicable is a priori. They have a faith commitment to not needing faith commitments. That's basically so I hear what you're saying. In other words, if it's all embracing, surely they must have run into things that they couldn't explain. And the answer is, of course, they did all the time, right? But the thing is that they don't have a true concept of the inexplicable. They only have a concept of inexplicable to me for now, right? There's no at the baseline truth, this must be explicable. How do I know? It's a faith commitment. That's actually how I know, right? It's an a priori decision. That's kind of what we're discussing, right? Aristotle, when he wakes up in the morning, says, everything in the universe makes sense. I believe this with all my soul, right? That's not a rational statement. That's probably unprovable, right? But he has this faith commitment, and that faith commitment informs everything that he sees. So if he sees something that he can't explain, he doesn't say it's fundamentally inexplicable, right? The idea of the fundamentally inexplicable was introduced to philosophy in modern times. Really did not exist. I would say before 600 years ago, maybe, something like that. The very concept didn't exist. It was, if you believed it, you weren't a philosopher. And if you were a philosopher, you didn't believe it. The two things didn't, the whole, like David Hume was very famous for introducing things like this into philosophy around 500 years ago, 600 years ago, something like that. The idea of something being actually uncaused. And it was actually with the breaking apart of the concept of causality that really philosophical modernity began. This was exactly this was exactly what broke down. This was the break, right? The break was, why do you assume that everything has to have a cause, basically, right? Maybe causes are much more loose and not so defined as you think it is, and really that made the entire philosophical room for modernity as we know it, which is another very interesting topic. But I'm getting very far afield, right? We have something from, you have the God of philosophy, the God that exists, so to speak, and then you have the God that transcends the puzzle, transcends things making sense, who can make things be something from nothing. And the fundamental mistake is thinking, that God works is defined, is limited to causing things as an existence, to causing things within those rules. And we gave an example last week. We gave an example last week like this. We said, God is not like a human artisan. That was our example from last week. This is an example from the Tanya as well, so people who have been in the class for a long time will have heard this already months and months ago where we studied it in Tanya. When a human artisan makes a vessel, right? Like we said, a potter takes the lump of clay and makes a pot, right? The first point to understand, and really we're only at the beginning of this whole explanation, so if there's things that feel off, it could be because we haven't really gotten through this yet. But the first thing to understand is that there's a difference between when God, meaning the God of Kabbalah, the God beyond existence, creates something, and when this artisan turns the lump of clay into a pot. The difference fundamentally is like this. The artisan, when he takes the lump of clay and makes it into a pot, is not actually creating anything, right? When you are limited to logical modes of expression, right? When everything is limited to fitting together, right? A cause, causing something to be, or making something is defined as things coming together to produce this result. In the human reality, in the reality of our world that we see around us, as we just said, in the philosophical reality, in the reality as it's according to logic, and Chassidus isn't denying that this is true about most things, by the way. We're just saying that because God is above the whole system, it doesn't have to apply to him, right? So in other words, this point is likely very true. We're not denying this point. We're just saying, why would you limit God with this, is really what we're saying. When we look at the world around us, things that are events are all things coming together. There's always two parties to an event, right, in our world. So for example, when the potter makes the pot, there's the person and there's the lump of clay. Neither of them on their own are going to make a pot. The lump of clay has the potential to be in the form of a pot, but it can't get there on its own. The lump of clay will sit there forever and never become a pot on its own, right? A human being has an artistic vision. He knows how to make a pot, right? But if the human being is left to his own devices, he can't become a pot. I have no means, I have no medium, I have no material by myself to make a pot. The idea of the pot doesn't hold soup, right? The lump of clay can't be a pot at all. But the idea of the pot, which the potter has in his head, right, can't hold soup. You have an issue. So they form a partnership. And everything that is caused in our reality is caused in this way, as a partnership, right? Everything has multiple ingredients. When he comes and he makes the pot, he takes the image that he has, or his knowledge of how to make a pot. We would say the traditional philosophical way of saying it is he takes the form of the pot from his mind, and he puts it into the clay using his hands, right? He takes it and he forms it into this vessel, right? And something amazing happens. He can get up and go get falafel in the shuk, and this pot will still maintain its shape. This pot remains in existence. Why does this pot remain in existence? This is really the point of what we discussed last week. This pot remains in existence because all of its elements existed before. The only thing that changed is that now they exist together, in partnership. They exist linked together, whereas before they existed separate. Before the lump of clay existed, the idea of the pot existed, right? Nothing is created by making the pot. You're taking two things and you're putting them together so that they become one, really, is what's happening. The idea of the pot and the lump of clay are coming into a unity to make the result, which is this pot of clay. Now, since the idea of the pot and the lump of clay both existed before the potter woke up this morning, so if you thought about it yesterday, I guess, right? Since these things both existed before the pot was made, there is no reason why they shouldn't continue to exist now that they've been put together. They existed before. Now they both just exist together in a different place. All the potter has really done is brought out a potential that always existed in this lump of clay to be in the form of a pot, right? And it can exist just as the lump of clay existed before the potter got there. And this is how things work in the logical world, which more or less, with some exceptions, is the world in which we live. The world in which we live, the way things work is that when new things are created by putting old things together. That's how things work in our reality, right? Old things with new potentials brought out, with that potential has to be brought out by something else that exists, right? If the potter doesn't exist, he can't make a pot. If the clay doesn't exist, he also can't make a pot. They both have to exist in the same reality, and they collide in a beautiful and precise way, and this creates the pot. But there's nothing new here. There's no real chidush. The elements existed before. The only difference is now they exist together. We said, why would you limit God and say that he has to work like this? God doesn't exist within this system. God is not like a human artisan, right? God does not go out and find things that he can add to and bring it out to be a certain way. God creates things, something from nothing. What do we mean by something from nothing, as we explained at great length last week? What we mean by something from nothing is that he can create it without any ingredients going into it, without any things coming together, right? How does God bake a cake? He says, let there be a cake. That's how God bakes a cake. A human being needs ingredients, right? That's how all cakes have been made since the beginning of time. They all have ingredients, right, that are not cakes. God, in fact, if you have all the ingredients together and it's already a cake, then it's already here and you can't make it, which is really one of the philosophical ramifications of what we're discussing, right? And the whole point of making it is that if it was already here, all mixed together, then it would exist already. So when we make something, it's by necessarily different ingredients coming together, whatever. That was all parenthetical. When God makes a cake, he says, let there be a cake. It's brought forth, right, without ingredients, without an existing cause. Not without a cause. Without a cause, God forbid, means it doesn't come from God, right? Without an existing cause. It's not by two things interacting that God brings something into existence. He's not limited to do that. He's not limited to being that. He doesn't exist within the laws of things having to fit together, right? So God can make something exist without a cause that exists. What happens when you make something exist without a cause that exists? We're going to read on and we're going to get into the full ramifications. But the first thing to know is that God can't go walking in the shuk and get a falafel and the thing would still exist. Why? Because this thing was actually made to exist by God. It has no previous existence on which to rely. You can't say the clay existed before God got here and all he's doing out is bringing out a potential. The two things, all the ingredients existed, now they're just together. There were no ingredients for this thing before God said, let there be a cake, or let there be a pot, or let there be anything. There were no ingredients. There's no existing cause for this thing. So the fact that it now exists, the fact that it's here now, reflects what? It reflects that God is making it be here now at every moment. If God went and he got a falafel in the shuk and he left the world to its own devices, what would happen to the world? The world would return to absolute nothingness. It's not like...
Would he sell this falafel?
What?
Would he sell this falafel?
He'd be over there creating the falafel, right? The Kabbalist walks into the falafel stand and he says, "Make me one with everything." Right? That's the classic joke. And then he gives the falafel guy $20, and the falafel guy takes the $20. The Kabbalist says, "Where's my change?" The falafel guy tells him, "Change must come from within." It's from my Borscht Belt act.
Take a look how God is beautiful.
Yeah.
He's so beautiful that he gave us a theory of boom.
Yeah.
To one day to reach that and live comfortable with that.
The Big Bang, yeah.
Know everything.
Yeah.
So at the creation of life, boom, a big boom.
Yeah.
He makes the boom, I make a boom. So we have a boom now. So now we explain everything and people live in peace.
It goes back to
How this creation was, it was a big boom.
Yeah.
A big boom, all right.
What do they call that particle?
The God particle, the Higgs boson,
Yeah.
that makes nothing into something. But where does the boson come from?
Aha!
And you know what, Speaker? The moment that I take a look, they're happy with that, and everybody agree with that. But the moment that I see the idea how narrow mind comes out to a very narrow thing, it was a big boom, and that's it. You know?
And don't ask any more questions, right?
That's it, a big boom, you know. Big booms happen every day over in the Yakum, you know. I mean, booms in the Yakum.
Where does the material for the big boom come from?
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
Who created the big boom planet nest, the rocks?
Right. And in general, when you read these things and they say from nothing, they generally have a very, very, a relaxed definition of nothing, right? They say it emerges automatically from the quantum foam, which is like nothing. Excuse me, if there's foam, right, that's not nothing. Anyway, whatever. That's a whole other discussion. But I'm not here to do quantum physics and Kabbalah. That's the lecture down the hall.
Everybody knows it's just all numbers.
That's Dr. Imbo's lecture.
Yes, Dr. Imbo's lecture when he was here. So I want to read a little bit with the 5 minutes, 10 minutes we have left, okay? I'm on page Lamed Tes, about halfway down. Line starts de mathias. I'm starting with Dezeo Hefresh, actually going back a little bit, but that's okay. Says the Holy Rebbe Rashab, Dezeo Hefresh bein hishtalshlus ilava alu labriya yashma'ayin. This is the difference between the chain of cause and effect, which is what we have been calling the philosophical or the logical reality, right? This is the difference between the chain of causes and effects, lebriya yashmai, to the creating ex nihilo, creating something from nothing. The ishtalshalos ilava aluk shenis gala mathias alul ein mathias mischadesh kan beikare v'kvar haya kameshu b'mathiusay b'makere. When in the chain of causes and effects, in the philosophical universe, in the universe that has to follow the rules of logic, when the existence of the effect is revealed, in other words, when an effect is revealed, right, there's a cake here now, or there's a pot, or any other effect, really, I'm pushing the pen across the table, also an effect, right? When an effect is revealed...
Where's the wall?
Good question. The mathias is not, this effect is not innovated in the main, it's not really new, and it already existed as it does now in its source, right? When any effect that takes place in our reality traces back to a cause and existed within those causes in potential, right? And again, this is actually how the philosopher finds God, right? In the broadest sense. He says, here's an effect that I see in the world that I cannot fully explain except by some other thing. And then he goes, look at that other thing, and he says, I can't fully explain this except with some further thing. And eventually, right, the buck has to stop. Eventually there has to be something which is explained in itself, which is the philosophical definition of God, which depends on nothing. But everything depends on it, as we explained before. Yes?
I think the one philosophy course I took in college before I thought this was ridiculous, is they were literally coming up with proofs of God,
Right.
And I'm like, where's the fallacy in this? Because you cannot prove God. You just say they weren't saying that the old world needs evidence.
Right.
The sin has created itself. It's a logical
Right.
proof of God, which I think is impossible, correct?
Right.
Coming up with it according to these logical, step 1, step 2, step 3, therefore, God exists. And I don't think that that's possible.
In my opinion, the proofs are good. The problem is that it's not God they land on. That's in my opinion. The proofs are pretty good. The problem is that as has really been the theme of the class, right? What they're landing on is not God. What they're landing on is something that they need that explains the proofs. I think the proofs are pretty okay. I mean, if you really study, if you get a newer book on some of the ancient proofs, the proofs are pretty decent. The problem is that, of course, there's two issues with them. Number one is that I don't believe philosophically that those proofs result in God or give you God at the end. It gives you something else, not God himself. But the second issue is that they're not emotionally satisfying. And the reason they're not emotionally satisfying is because they're so trivial, right? In other words, and it goes together, the two things go together, right? It's not emotionally satisfying because it just seems to be describing some facet of our reality that we always assumed was there, and has none of the none of the dimensionality, none of the reality of the God that the Torah describes. Right? We're not describing a God who cares about human action and listens to prayers and enters into history to take the Jews out of Egypt. Right? That's not what the proofs for God seem to be landing on at all. Right? So it's very emotionally unsatisfying. And the reason why is, as we're discussing tonight, because what the proofs of God prove is they're landing on something that's God's perhaps a representation of God within the system, right? That they need to make the system work. But making the system work has not been a human priority for hundreds of years, right? That's not what we care about nowadays, for whatever reason, right? I don't even know if back in the day, by the way, even if back in ancient Greece, if so many people cared, right? There's a reason that Socrates got arrested and executed, right? You know what I'm saying? In other words, it takes a special kind of person to find these proofs moving or at all religious or at all deeply significant to the soul in any way. So I agree with you in that sense. As I was saying before, so when you have cause and effect within the system, right, the effect is not new. The effect already exists in potential in its prior cause, right? Really, when we see an effect in our logical reality, the effect that we're seeing is only the revelation of something that was previously concealed. It's not something new. Before, you didn't see this effect, right? Oh, I didn't know that piece of clay had the potential to be a pot. Now it's revealed. It's revealed. The clay all along had the ability to be a pot. What the potter's come along has shown, right? Or that the marble could be a statue of David, or whatever it is, right? Or that the pen, or even something very trivial, like the pen had the ability to be on that side of the table, right? I didn't know that. That was concealed. Now it's revealed, and you can see that it's different things coming together, because I also didn't know that my hand had the ability to move the pen to the other side of the table, right? We're not speaking, this isn't very profound, this is very simple what we're saying, right? The cause and effect in our reality is not something new, it's revealing what was always in potential. It's revealing something that was always there in the things that already existed. In fact, if any of these elements didn't already exist, they wouldn't be able to interact, and you would have no effect. If the pen doesn't exist, I can't move it to the other side of the table. It's only because the pen exists and has the potential to be on the other side of the table that I can move it to the other side of the table, right? And in case you think it's too glib, so you can go and complicate it, like of course the ancient Greeks did, and you can explain that if there was a 2-ton truck in the room, that doesn't have the potential to be on the other side of the table in the same way that the pen does, because the table would collapse. So then it becomes more complicated. Things have potentials, different potentials according to their forms, right? That's why you can make clay into a pot, but you can't make Coca-Cola into a pot that holds soup, right? It just doesn't go unless you freeze it. Then you could argue it's no longer Coca-Cola, and then you're well on your way to becoming a real philosopher, right? So you understand. Anyway, so the ukamei seichel u'midos. So this is new. Now that we're over time for our hour, we can read something new. Kamei seichel u'midos the mathias hamida haya kedem b'seichel. Like, for example, what's the classic example in Chassidus of something from something, of within the logical order? Is seichel and midos, is intellect and emotions. You have intellect and you have emotions that follow the intellect, right? The matzias hamida haya kedem b'seichel. When you have an emotion, or we're describing an emotion that is caused by the intellect, right? Which unfortunately, depending on who we are, not necessarily all our emotions are caused by the intellect necessarily. We're talking about when the emotions are being used in the way God intended, which is that the emotion should be affected and controlled by the intellect, right? So, in such a case, like let's say what as Chassidus describes, right? If you contemplate just a little bit, say during Psukei de Zimra and davening, right? After between Baruch She'amar and Yishtabach, right? And it's talking there about the natural beauty of the world, right? God makes the snow on the mountains like wool, right? And all the trees will clap hands, and the whole as it beautifully says, all the Psalms that we read there, all the Tehillim it says there. If a person contemplates that even a little bit, as it says in Chassidus, it brings a person to, it sparks a little love of God. It can spark a little feeling if the person has done the correct preparation, etc., right? That can lead to a feeling in the heart. That contemplation can bring a person to a love of Hashem, right? But that love of Hashem is not a love of Hashem that is being created within the person. That love was implicit in the thing that you were thinking about and the way you were thinking about it, right? It's two somethings coming together. You have a heart. You have an idea in your head of the greatness of God and the beauty that He's created, for example, right? And that idea comes and affects your heart, just like the potter comes and he forms the clay, right? That idea comes and informs and affects your heart. It affects the material of your emotions, whatever that is, the raw material of the emotions, to produce this emotional effect. But it's not that the emotion didn't exist before. It's not that the emotion has been created something from nothing. The emotion already existed in potential in the thought. It's just that when you were thinking about it intellectually and it hadn't been born in your heart yet, you didn't feel it so much. It's only when it comes into the emotions of the heart, and then it's revealed from its concealed state. That it was when it was in the intellect, and it comes into revelation in the heart. Not that the thing was really innovated anew. Unlike creating something from nothing. The whole idea of creating something from nothing is that the something is absolutely 100% new relative to its source. And that's really what we mean by something from nothing. Something from nothing means that the effect and the cause, nothing in common. There's nothing in common between the effect and the cause, which is the opposite of how things work in our reality. In the logical reality, the way God has created the world to follow the rules of logic, that's not how things work. In our reality, effects existed in potential in their cause. The cake existed in potential in its ingredients, right? The pot existed in potential in the clay and the artisan. When God creates, the whole idea of creation, something from nothing, is that God can make something exist that there was no potential for in its cause. There was no room for this thing to exist at all. It didn't exist in the cause that created it in any way. Even the philosophers admit, even they concede, that if the physical were to be created from the spiritual, there is no greater something from nothing than this. V'hainu shenishave davar miloi davar. Something came into being from a non-thing. A davar miloi davar. Something from a non-thing comes into being. And God is able to do that. God is able to take something that doesn't exist, that is godliness, which we say doesn't exist because it transcends existence, right? And from that, He makes something that exists by our worldly definition of existence, right? Davar miloi davar, a thing from a non-thing. V'hinei davar v'lei davar hem hafchim ze mezeh. A thing and a non-thing are opposites one another. And it doesn't get more opposite than that. Something and nothing. Umuvan de beloi davar efshar liyeh shum metzias davar. It's understood that in a non-thing, there's no room for anything to exist in a non-thing, right? Let's say everything is spiritual, right? Spiritual to the physical is really the only something from nothing we can comprehend, even though Kabbalah says that there's many, many levels and it takes place repeatedly, something from nothing. Most of these are really impossible to comprehend, even to describe, really, pretty impossible. But at the lowest level, right, when we go from not having materiality, physicality, when we go from the non-physical to the physical, right, which is the last step of creation, in Kabbalah, right? The final step of creation is to go from the non-physical to the physical. Now, at the moment, assuming time exists, I always have to say that for some of our students, assuming time exists, at the moment where there is no physical thing, what potential is there for a physical thing to exist? With what are you going to make? With what material or what cause are you going to make a physical thing? And the answer is there's nothing. Spiritual cannot become physical. And even if we can't really fully explain this, it's hard to nail down even what we mean by physical and spiritual, right? Intuitively, this has a very powerful ring of truth about it. There's something about this that really helps us understand this concept of something from nothing. A spiritual thing, right? An example given elsewhere in Chassidus is that you can take something spiritual and make it coarser, right? Like let's say you have a very lofty idea, like King Solomon and all of his parables is mashalim, right? So if you have a very lofty idea, you can bring that idea down and make it coarser. You can take that idea and use a metaphor to explain it to a lower student, and another metaphor to explain it to an even lower student. And you can bring it lower and lower and coarser, until even a very young child could understand this very lofty and complicated idea, right? They have books like The Theory of Relativity for 5-year-olds or whatever it is, right? And that's what they attempt to do. They attempt to take a very abstract idea, which is normally describable only with the very refined tools of mathematics and very advanced mathematics, and bring it down to a very low and coarse place where even the mind of a small child can understand it, right? This process of taking an idea and making it more coarse, making it lower, making it more physicized, less abstract, right? There is no process of making an idea less abstract. You can make it less abstract and less abstract forever. You can run the process infinitely. Never will a physical object pop out of this process. Right? I take the idea and I make it less abstract and less abstract. At what point does it become fully concrete? At what point does it become something I can touch with my hands? And the answer is that there is no process to take something spiritual and make it physical. There's no process to take a mental idea and turn it into a physical object. These two things are a something and a nothing, right? A concept does not exist physically, and vice versa, right? And even if you want to say that there's some correlates in the physical world and blah, 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 the brain waves and electrical signals in the brain and all of that, which I'm not sure how much I believe in all of that anyway. But even if you do, right, believe that that's the physical manifestation of the idea, it's still inexplicable how the two relate to one another, right? How does the idea relate to the changes in the brain that the idea makes, right? How does spiritual affect physical, right? So, we'll stop here. So the physical and spiritual are opposites one from another, and it's understood that something, a physical thing that comes from the spiritual is like yesh ma'ayin, is like something from nothing. And something from nothing cannot be explained. The whole definition of something from nothing, it's not explained by things coming together. Something from nothing is a totally different type of causality, of causing something to be, where the effect or the result does not exist in the cause in any way whatsoever. And once you as we're going to discuss, not next week because it's Pesach, maybe the following week and the coming weeks. What? As we'll discuss in the coming weeks, God willing. As we'll discuss in the coming weeks, whenever we discuss it, as we'll discuss as when this class continues, something that is created, something from nothing, is a totally different type of thing than something that's created in the world of logic.
Because